Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Matt Smith. I'm the airport director of Gwinnett County Airport. I'm also the vice president of Georgia Airport Association. And today we're going to be hearing from Stephanie Ward, and it's my honor to introduce her. Stephanie is the lead planner and project manager for Mead Hunt. She's also the project manager for GAA's Airspace Protection Legislation Study, which she'll be talking to us about a little bit today. Stephanie has developed planning documents for all types of airports and has prepared more than 250 studies for airports, states, and national aviation agencies. She has a background in urban planning, which gives her a unique understanding of land use challenges around airports. Stephanie was the principal investigator for the Airport Cooperative Research Program report, Enhancing Airport Land Use Compatibility, which led her to become a lead author for the FAA Advisory Circular 5090.4B, also titled Airport Land Use Compatibility. So I can say that Stephanie has literally written the book on airport land use compatibility. And I will turn it over to you, Stephanie.
Great, thanks, Matt. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody. You can go to the next slide if you want to, Matt. I'm honored to be able to talk with you a little bit today about the project that we're undertaking right now for GAA. It's ironic. I am literally sitting in a highway rest area because I was at a meeting this morning talking about abrogation easements and tree removal at a client of ours. And as you can imagine, as most of you on the call have probably had to deal with this, it was fairly contentious and went way longer than expected. So I'm being creative here in our presentation today because I wasn't able to get back to my office to talk to you. So I figure it must be an all land use kind of day here. So with the presentation, I really wanted to just touch a little bit about why are we looking at trying to potentially establish some legislation, specifically focusing on height related, but also possibly some land use for the state of Georgia. And then talk a little bit about some of the pieces and parts that we're assembling to help make that argument to the state legislators to document, if you will, why this is an important issue. And then most importantly, talk to you about something that's going to be coming across your desk, hopefully within the next few days, maybe next week, in terms of a survey that we're looking for some assistance with. So we'll try to cover that and then plan to leave plenty of time for questions that you might have of me. If we go to the next slide. Next slide. So first, why legislation? First and foremost, it's about grant assurances. So if you go to the next slide, grant assurance number 20. So all of you on the call, if you've taken federal dollars from FAA for the development of your airport, you have signed grant assurances. Number 20 specifically says that you're going to address hazard removal and mitigation. So you can see here, this is a direct quote from the grant assurance. And the part that's highlighted is probably what I consider to be the most important as it relates to the topic at hand, which is preventing the establishment or creation of future airport hazards. So that has to do with, we don't want things to get any worse than they already are. So we're looking at how do we maintain tree growth? How do we keep tall structures such as wind turbines, cell towers, etc., buildings out of our approaches so that we maintain the integrity of our airports. Next slide. We also have Grant Assurance 21 that's talks specifically about providing for compatible land use. And so one of the ways that FAA says in the grant assurance that we can do that is by establishing and adopting zoning laws that can restrict the types of land use that are going to be considered non-compatible or incompatible, depending upon the term you like to use, with the airport operations. And as Matt mentioned, we did an ACRP project, Report 27, which then kind of translated into the advisory circular. And FAA has finally acknowledged that, as we say in the industry, when you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. The same can kind of be said as it relates to land use and height limitations because each airport's going to be different. An airport that is out in the middle of a current farm field, we probably want to be a little more aggressive with our establishment of zoning regulations because we don't want it to get any worse. We want to keep that open area. If it's an airport that's already in a very heavily built urban environment, then we're just trying to make it not any worse than it already is. There's probably not a lot that we can do, but how can we keep it from getting worse or getting other types of uses that might be more incompatible. So these grant assurances point to that. And one of the things that I think is really important about the timing of this study is the fact that with the new reauthorization of the AIP program, one of the elements that's in the new Reauthorization Act says that the FAA can issue penalties for noncompliance. Well, the grant assurances are some of the things that you're saying you're going to be in compliance with. So there's many of us in the industry that are now kind of waiting to see if FAA will use that as any sort of teeth to come back to say to an airport sponsor, well, you have a grant assurance and you haven't done your due diligence to adopt zoning, land use regulations, et cetera, to address these types of issues. So kind of new territory for us moving forward with the new authorization that might create some additional challenges for us, might also create some teeth. Sometimes it's easy to pass the buck upward, if you will, that as we discuss why do we need to do this, we can clearly say, well, not only is it a grant assurance, but now there's penalties associated with it potentially that make it a little more visible, if you will, to some of our higher ups that would potentially push back on the idea of this type of a legislation. So that's really the nuts and bolts of why we do it, coupled with being a good neighbor. Trying to protect the safety and welfare of the airport and those who utilize it, as well as our neighbors around it. Creating incompatible uses or height obstructions that are going to create hazards to air navigation. Create for situations where we could have a incident where an aircraft could hit one of those obstructions and cause injury or even death to both those on the aircraft as well as those on the ground. So certainly an important topic to us. And so that's kind of sets the groundwork of, so why are we talking about this? Next slide. So one of the things that we've done as a part of this study was try to break down a little bit the different pieces and parts about what's happening in Georgia right now that helps us set the stage to tell a story to the state legislators of why now? Why is this important? So if you go to the next slide, one of the things that we've done is we've taken a look at the current CIPs that GDOT has on record for all of the airports within the state. And we specifically were looking at the next 5 years, so 25 through 29. And we were looking at the types of projects that point to either height limitation issues or potential land use. And that has to do with land acquisition, easement acquisition, because often we need one or the other to help remove an obstruction, the actual design, and then construction project, so obstruction removal. And then in some cases we had combined projects. So as you see here on the slide, we've got over 111 projects currently on the existing 5 years worth of CIPs, totaling over $37 million worth of projects that are specifically targeted at obstruction removal, either buying the easement rights so that we can go in and clear them, actually clearing them might be more significant with the land acquisition. So there's a huge investment here in dollars over the next 5 years. And these are just at the airports that know it. Many of you on the phone may have found yourself in a situation, I know I do, where you have FAA do a flight check on a PAPI, and the next thing you know, you've got an obstruction issue. Something has grown up in between PAPI checks, and now you've got something to deal with that, maybe isn't on your CIP yet. So I would say that this 37 million is probably the tip of the iceberg, if you will, of this project, and it points to the fact that this is a pretty substantial issue. And I would also note that this is not just a Georgia issue. Like I mentioned, I'm dealing with a project right now where we're talking about 14 parcels, and that's the first of 4 phases that are going to probably have 14 to 15 additional parcels in each phase. So again, and that's just one airport. So and a lot of that has to do with, we have this nasty habit that trees, and we often talk about them the most, have a nasty habit of growing, but we can't, forget other things like cell towers, wind turbines, tall structures. Those are all things that we also need to be thinking about when we're talking about this topic. So that's been important for us to capture that. So that's going to be a piece of data that we're going to utilize as a part of our working paper that's going to support the legislation. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that we've got an assessment that we've done of what we've called the 5-mile radius. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things that's important as we look at this topic is to determine, well, who's going to be impacted, because that's often a question that we get from legislators when we start talking about a project. So what you see illustrated here on the graphic is every public use airport, the 105 public use airports in the state, and they have a 5-mile radius from the airport reference point shown on the graphic. And we also have the 539 different municipalities were identified, as well as the counties. And so we've identified which counties are affected because of one of these 5-mile radiuses, and or the municipalities. And so you can see from the slide, 195 different municipalities fall within that 5-mile radius. So that's about 36% of all of the municipalities in the state. And we've got over 80% of the counties accounted for, with 127 out of the 159. So that makes a pretty robust data set, if you will, of entities that more than likely are going to be impacted by any type of legislation that's proposed. Either they're going to need to manage it, administer it, just generally be impacted. So we thought this was important so that we get our arms around who's impacted and how and why. And the reason for that is, many of you on the phone, you may be a city-owned airport that sits within the county. You might be a county-owned airport that sits within this boundary of the city, or maybe multiple cities. And so that's going to make administration of any type of land use or height limitation zoning or ordinance, if you will, complicated. So we're trying to narrow that down so that we can explain, here's how we might fashion the legislation to help administer that. And this is one step of doing that. If we go to the next slide, you'll see in the next couple slides kind of demonstrate why this is important. So this is an example of a Butler Municipal Airport. In that 5-mile radius, we've got one county impacted, Tyler County, and one municipality of Butler. So this one's a little easier in that we've got two entities that we're going to want to talk to as it relates to any sort of legislation that comes down where we're affecting either height or land use or both. So it's hopefully a little smoother conversation with only two. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see how some of these things can become much more complicated. So this is Augusta Regional. Obviously, you can see with the purple, there's a municipality involved. Well, that's the municipality of Augusta, the city of Augusta. We also have Richland County. So it looks kind of easy, but you can see in the kind of blue color, we extend on the eastern side into South Carolina. So that complicates it. We're jumping state boundaries. And you can see in the middle, we've got some overlap, and that's joint airspace with Daniel Field, their GA airport within Richmond County. So there we've got a potential conflict between airspace. So if we're thinking about different zoning ordinances that are going to look at height limitations, in this instance where we've got airspace overlapping, you would need to look at some sort of blended approach, no pun intended, to bring those heights together so that you aren't talking to Augusta and, well, they've got, as you extend farther away from Augusta, you might find that the heights go up. So you've got a higher allowable elevation as it relates to Augusta, but you might have a more restrictive height related to Daniel Field. So looking at that where we have these overlaps of airspace would be very critical in any type of legislation that we develop, or at least in the local document that gets developed to administer it. So again, complicated as we look at some of these. If we go to the next slide, you'll see this is where Middle Georgia is an example. So here we've got 3 municipalities, 5 counties, and joint airspace. So going to make that one very challenging to sit down, work through, discuss with, 8 different municipalities who could very likely have some sort of role in the legislation or administration of. So again, important because we want to be cognizant of this going in, that yeah, there's going to be some negotiation, there's going to be some conversation that has to take place. It's not just going to be a slam dunk. We go to the next one that really kind of shows another version. So this is Franklin Hart Airport. Again, here we've got 6 municipalities, 3 counties, and fairly widespread. So, as you move farther out in that 5-mile radius, you're probably talking a higher height limitation. You're probably talking less land use restrictions. So you might be having a different conversation with the 2 municipalities to the south than you would the 2 that are, most closely neighboring the airport environment. So again, elements that we want to bring to the table just because we want to make sure that legislators understand that we know it's not going to be easy. There is negotiation, there is conversation, there is cooperation that's going to have to take place with anything that we develop. If we go to the next slide, you see the granddaddy of them all, right? We had to throw in Atlanta just because we are writing proposing some legislation that hopefully would be statewide. And, here we have 10 municipalities and 3 counties. So certainly the poster child for it's complicated all the way down to Butler, where it's not as complicated. So next slide. So we're taking that information into consideration as we're developing what our talking points will be for the legislators, as well as thinking about what do those different scenarios mean in terms of how would we administer and how might we frame out some of the legislation. I'll come back to that in just a moment. So we also are looking at what are other states doing. As I understand it, one of the presentations that prompted this conversation was from one of my coworkers, Lisa Harmon, who talked about the general aviation zoning project that we did for ACRP. And in that, Georgia is one of the few states in the nation who doesn't have any form of height or land use limitation zoning to protect the airports. And so I think that's where some of this conversation started. So one of the elements that we looked at was we were going to look at, well, what are the best things that are happening out there that we can draw from? Well, that got a little complicated, and you're probably starting to have a drinking game of how many times I say that. But it was challenging to point to any of the other states and saying, well, that's the perfect one, we could adopt that here, because individual states and how you're going to want to administer a height or a land use ordinance or a legislation is much like that statement of, you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. Because if I point to a poster child on paper of a statewide zoning and legislation that on paper looks really good, well, we point to the state of California. And I know for a lot of states, the first thought is, yeah, we're not California. So, like I said, on paper, it looks great. It looks like it really should protect the airports. It looks like it should be good on paper. But in reality, what that program does is create standalone airport land use compatibility groups who are in charge, commissions who are in charge of land use within their county. So as you see from the graphic that I just showed, a minute ago, a number of those, we've got situations where we're crossing county lines. Do you really want another third party involved in this equation that's managing this? So, California is really off the table. And then when we went and looked at a number of the other sites or states that we feel are good representations, there were a lot of state nuances that played into the conversation. So instead of looking at other states in totality, we instead decided that we would do is give you a sample of what the surrounding states. So what are your neighbors doing? And the reason for that is often a lot of the pushback that we get from legislators about instituting any type of statewide guidance is the fact that, well, we don't want to discourage economic development. And so with that in mind, our thought was if we look at what's happening in your neighbors, we could clearly say, well, if they leave Georgia or if they are looking at Georgia and they're concerned at all about any of this legislation that we would propose, they're their next tier would be your neighbors. And so as you can see from this graphic, all of your neighbors have something already on the books that they are doing. Now it varies. As you can see in Alabama, they're at a 2 mile from the airport, and they're looking predominantly at a hazard area. Oh, excuse me. So they've got a boundary that they've identified that they're looking at in terms of predominantly height. When we look at Florida, Florida is a 3 mile radius, and as you can see under the basis, they're looking at it through Part 77 surfaces. So Part 77 surfaces that are within a 3 mile radius of the airport, individual communities are supposed to be regulating land use and height within those areas. When we look at South Carolina as another example, they have airport overlay districts, as well as a state Title 55 that requires land use zoning. They also use Part 77. And if any of you are familiar with that one, that's an interesting one because Title 55 put the responsibility on South Carolina Aeronautics Commission to develop a method to administer this and provide guidance to the individual municipalities who are subject to it. So what they did is they created what's called the CLUE tool, the Compatible Land Use Evaluation CLUE tool, which is a GIS-based tool that a local municipality can enter the data that they need to get a finding from South Carolina Aeronautics Commission regarding proposed land uses. It helps identify it because it's, again, in the geographic environment, you can point and click, and you can find out, is this piece of property in one of the areas that has to be evaluated? There's also what we call a sandbox where you can go in and you could enter different types of uses and find out, would that be considered compatible? You could enter a height and find out, is that going to be a penetration? So, they've leaned into that by providing a tool that helps administer their state law that looks at land use and height. So those are just some samples. So again, what we're doing as it relates to looking at this is our plan is to provide the legislators with some comparisons to what's happening in your neighboring states. Again, thinking about it from that economic development standpoint that, hey, if you can't develop within 3 miles of this airport here in Georgia, they're not going to find it really any better in any of your surrounding states because they've also got legislation that looks at land use and compatibility and height. So again, another piece of information that we'll be utilizing to help craft the legislation and the story for the legislators as far as why should they support something like this. And then if we go to the next slide, so last but not least, I said there was some homework here. So one of the things that we want to be able to do is tell the story of what's really happening in Georgia today. So we're going to be issuing an airport survey. GAA is going to handle the distribution of that. And so your participation as airport managers, consultants, etc., is going to be key. So we're going to ask for each of you on the call, please share it with your peers, get them to participate, because the answers to these questions are going to be very helpful in us developing the legislation as well as supporting it, where we can point to and say, I'm hoping that we can say 100% of the airports responded and this is what they told us. This is why it's important. So I'm just going to real briefly go through some of the questions and explain to you a little bit of why we're asking the question. That way, when you get the survey, hopefully you won't have to scratch your head and go, what were they thinking? You'll know. And then if you also hear any of your other airport managers, if they fill out the survey and they call you and say, hey, did you catch that webinar? You can fill in the blanks for them as well. So if we go to the next slide, we're trying to capture, as I mentioned, current conditions at your GA airports. In a number of cases, there are open-ended spots for you to actually describe it. Please use that, and you'll see that here in a moment. And that information and those details will be pretty critical. So if we go to the next slide, so the two of the first questions are, what's currently happening at your airport? Do you currently have identified penetrations to the approach areas from either vegetation or tall structures? If yes, please explain what. Please tell us that, we've got a large wooded area, we've got residential parcels, we're fighting wind turbines, whatever it is, give us that detail if you could, please, because that'll be helpful in us explaining what kind of things we're up against. The second question you see there is, do you currently have any displaced thresholds because of that mitigation? So, do you have something that has created such an obstruction that you weren't able to deal with it through either acquisition or easements or removal, that you've displaced the threshold to deal with it? We'd like to know what that is and what's the degree of that. And is that a temporary solution because you can't negotiate something, or is that something that's, possibly in for the long haul? So if you can give us details on that, we would greatly appreciate that. Going to the next slide, this question has more to do with that CIP. And so obviously that CIP that we've got is already a little dated because, we're bouncing up here pretty quickly against the 25 fiscal year. So we're looking for, does your airport have any obstruction removal related projects coming up in your CIP? So maybe it's something that's presented itself recently. Maybe it's something that you're addressing locally only. So it's maybe a part of your local CIP and not your federal or state level CIP. Please share that if you would, so that we, again, can make a more robust part of that. And then if it's part of a phased project, so maybe you've got phase 1 scheduled in your current CIP, if you've got more phases that are going to come, say, in 2030, 2031, et cetera, we'd like to know about that too, because we don't want just that snapshot of 5 years. If we can explain that we've got a number of airports that have a long-term CIP dedicated towards obstruction removal, we'd like to know that as well. So if you can share that kind of information, that would be beneficial as well. The next slide, we're looking at, do you have noise sensitive areas or incompatible uses? So, the first couple questions are really talking about height related issues. We also, since we're talking with you, we're trying to build the base for, do we have compatibility issues? So here would be if you've got any types of uses that are considered noise sensitive or incompatible. And so examples of that would be, do you have schools? Do you have churches? Do you have hospitals? Those are the types of land uses that are considered noise sensitive. Do you have any of those in proximity to your airport? And I would use that 5-mile radius. As we know, you can fly an approach, a straight in approach, and you may be over some properties for a considerable amount of time. The other option would be, in a traditional traffic pattern, do you have any of these uses? When we look at incompatible uses, those are also things that are a little broader. So those are things that are going to attract wildlife. So bodies of water, landfills, I just lost it. Composting facilities, et cetera. Things that are going to attract wildlife, sewage treatment facilities, et cetera. So we're looking for those. We're looking for things that are going to create smoke, steam, glare, visual obstructions. We're also looking for concentrations of people. So if you've got large recreational facilities that might, have multiple ball fields that are attracting users, where we've got a lot of people in a single place at a single time. Mega churches are one that we're dealing with a lot across the country now. So those are all types of things that we're looking for. Are they in proximity to the airport so that we can talk about this with the legislators about, we've got airports that already have these issues. Let's say that 50% of you come back and say you do. Well, that's a good number for us to talk about that. Hey, we've got 50% that already have these incompatibilities. It's the other 50% that we want to keep from having this so that we protect the investment that's gone into the aviation infrastructure. So if we go to the next slide, the next question is, have you been involved in any litigation related to land use decisions? And I would open that up. That's also height related. So, if you've had to go to condemnation on any projects, those obviously add cost to the airport in terms of having to litigate those things. So we're looking here of, have you had to do any, and if so, some details about what was it and some cost so that we can get some information. be prepared. Depending upon what you list, we may be giving you a phone call to say, hey, explain this a little more for me so that we can get some details so we really understand what your responses might be. We go to the next slide. We're also looking at how does your current municipality or municipalities include the airport when making decisions around them? And you can see there's some examples. Is it a formal process where you get notified? Is it an informal process? I've got an example where I've got a manager who's got a great relationship with the local county planning director, and if there's anything within about a 3-mile radius, the planning director knows to call the airport manager, and he says, hey, is this any concern for you? Well, that's great, but if that planning manager retires, we have no formal process in place that protects and makes the next planning director still call that manager. So we're looking for how are you involved, if at all, and if you're involved, what's that look like? Is it formal, informal? Do you get notified, or is it purely you drive by and you happen to see the bulldozers on site and ground being turned? Obviously, we don't want those because that usually means it's too late for us to do anything about it. So that's the intent of that question. Going to the next slide, we're also looking at asking, which kind of relates to the previous one, is what's the cooperation level in enforcement of any of those issues? If you see something happening that's a concern for the airport, what's the general temperature from the local municipality in terms of dealing with it? If you as the airport manager call somebody up and say, hey, I understand this is happening, this could be a concern for the airport, what's their general response? Are they willing to hear you out, say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that, let's talk through it, let's see what we can do? Or is it, thanks, but no thanks, we need to move forward with this, and thanks for your information, but we're going to continue on. So we're interested in that because part of the reason for understanding how some of the municipalities are working with the airport sponsors leads directly into what type of legislation would we propose. Is it more top down or bottom up? And you'll see more about, I'll talk more about that in just a moment. So if we go to the next slide, this is kind of where that starts to gel. So this is purely to get your thought as an airport manager about what you think we should consider for that limitation, or for the height controls in particular. And where we're going with this is on the left-hand side, you'll see that we could write legislation that, as in bold, requires height restrictions around the airport. So, I mean, there has to be. So now it's a mandate. You as an airport sponsor have to have some sort of control. And there's a couple ways that we could do that. One would be to require sponsors to apply a standard of certain height restrictions. So as an example, Part 77. We say that all public use airports are going to have height limitation, in particular, that address the height limitations outlined by Part 77. That way, as you go airport to airport or community by community, you're going to know that you're going to see a standard. Now, obviously, some airports have a 20-to-1 approach, others have a 34-to-1, so it's not going to be standard across every airport, but the standard would be we're going to utilize Part 77 as our basis. The other option might be that we require sponsors to enact some sort of regulation, but we give them a locally defined surface. So back to some of our samples. So Augusta, as an example, might want to consider a blended set of surfaces that take into account Part 77, departure surfaces, PAPI surfaces, the whole gamut of different FAA related surfaces that have impacts to the airport operation. They might want to do a blended surface, and that option would give it that. So in that instance, there are some places, especially with departure surfaces, that might be more restrictive than Part 77. And so you might run into a situation where you could keep a development or manage a development under Part 77, but you might have an area that you say, hey, I really need that to be covered because of the departure surface, but that wouldn't be under the state legislation as such, depending upon which direction we go with this. Now, the other thing with that I would mention with the locally defined is, say I'm a developer and I'm working in different projects in different parts of the state of Georgia, that might make it a little more cumbersome for me to know what can I or can't I do in individual communities, because each individual airport could be picking different types of surfaces that they're adhering to. So that one does make it a little more complicated from a implementation standpoint and consistency across the state, but certainly does provide some flexibility to the airport. So that's one way to do it. So that's what I call the top down, that says the state enacts legislation that says if you're an airport, you will have zoning of some sort, or height limitation, et cetera. And we're specifically talking height to begin with around your airport in one of these two manners or a possible hybrid. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that we've also looking at what if we say that the state legislation allows. So the state gives the power that you as a local municipality or as an airport sponsor have the right to develop height restrictions around your airport. And it also has the same two caveats of the first one being a consistent surface, that you've got the right to enact something. And if you do, our suggestion would be Part 77 surfaces. That way you get that consistency across all airports. But the caveat being each individual airport sponsor would then need to exercise that right to establish it. It wouldn't be mandated that you must establish it. And then as you can see on the bottom of that column, allow for the development of locally defined surfaces. So it's kind of a tiered approach of either you got to do it or we're going to allow you to do it. And then as we go down in the matrix, it's a prescribed surface that we can all agree on, or it's locally developed. So those are two of the primary ways that we're looking at that we might fashion some of the legislation. And our direction on that may very well be driven by what we get back from some of the surveys. I'm anticipating, as an example, that many of you are going to share with us and saying, listen, some of our municipalities are not willing to work with us, in which case we're probably leaning that we need something a little heavier handed, which is the left-hand column that just flat out requires you. It requires you as a municipality to play in the sandbox with us to accomplish that. Because if we're in the allow, there's no hammer, if you will, there's no real teeth to say we have to do this. So that's where we're looking for some of your responses from the survey to help guide that conversation. So if we go to the next slide, we're planning to ask the questions, and then this really, I think, brings it home. That some of you might be sitting there shaking your head going, well, it sounds great, top down, but we're a county-owned airport that sits predominantly within a city limit, as an example. We've got the ability to zone around our, within our jurisdiction, but I can't cross into the city. Well, this next question gets to that point of what are your thoughts about extraterritorial zoning? So the state of Wisconsin is one of my favorite states who does this, but it's not perfect. As I mentioned earlier, that there's pieces and parts, excuse me, that I like and don't like within almost every state. Well, the state of Wisconsin allows for extraterritorial zoning. So it says that you as an airport sponsor, whoever you are, if you're a city, if you're a county, if you're an authority, you have the right to do extraterritorial zoning, so you can cross your municipal boundaries out to a 3-mile radius to develop land use zoning around your airport, which also includes height. So the upside to that is now you as the airport sponsor can cross those boundaries. You can force those other entities to come to the table to work with you. The downside, as I said, it's not all it's cracked up to be, is it allows, the state legislation allows a sponsor. So now you've got to get a airport sponsor who's willing to go to the mat, if you will, and force those other partners that are around them to come to the table regarding airport zoning. That can often be a challenge because you've probably got other municipal operating agreements or relationships that you're utilizing that sometimes sponsors are hesitant to jeopardize because of the airport. So it's great from the standpoint of it gives us the right to jump those political boundaries. The challenge with it is, in my opinion, is it's an allow legislation where it says you can, but it doesn't say you have to. So there's an awful lot of airports within the state of Wisconsin who still don't have airport land use zoning, even though they have this great piece of legislation because they're scared to make that jump. They do have height limitation because that is done at the state level. They have a separate ordinance, separate statute that clearly says the state of Wisconsin will develop height limitation, and that it gets disseminated out to the airport. So that one's not optional. That one has to be done. So it's kind of a strange mix there of haves and have-nots, if you will, that make it challenging to do. So this question gets at the how receptive do you think your local municipalities that would be impacted in that 5-mile radius, as an example, if we stuck with that, to being willing to work with you on an ordinance. And so we're looking for very, anywhere from not receptive to very receptive. I'm guessing we'll get a lot of in the middle is my guess. So that kind of wraps up the survey questions, I believe. We go to the next slide. We're looking for all of that input because that's going to be important for us to help, again, fashion the legislation as well as develop our support document of here's what the airports are telling us they need. So if we go to the next slide on the draft legislation, what we're really looking at here is we want to try to balance landowner rights with the public safety and welfare. We know that property owner rights are important. And so coming in too heavy-handed with a legislation that's going to really upset the apple cart is going to be a challenge. So we want to balance that. We also want to create language where we can guide that growth and protect the airport approaches. So there's a specific focus of why we're doing it, and we'll talk about the investment. The last system plan and economic impact study give us a really good base to talk about what's the future growth, what's the value of the aviation system of the state. So that gives us good pieces to work with. And we want to really give the authority to manage those height limitations. Right now, it's a complete Wild West as far as if anybody's doing it and how they're doing it. And so, we want to reduce those opportunities where it's you as the airport manager drive by and see the crane, a mile off the airport approach, and how did that happen? And we really want to craft that language with that last bullet point in mind, that we want to focus on controls that are generally permissive, so that we can focus on what's really the most important parts. And as we get farther away from the airport, we allow more to happen. We want to focus on the areas that are really key. So while we've mapped a 5-mile radius, we may end up at a 3-mile radius because that's really the core gotta haves. It could be, 3 miles around the airport, but the extended approaches get in. That's something that we're still looking at, trying to digest a few different ways that we could propose this. And some of it being the, quintessential, like think back to when you were a kid with your parents, or maybe your kids with you now, ask for more than you want and then be ready to settle for something less. So we're going to be framing that up as well of what's the gotta haves and what would be the really nice to haves. So with that, I believe that was the last slide with content. So some of our next steps, we're going to conduct those airport surveys. So we're going to have, I think, just a 2-week turnaround on those responses. So if you could answer those questions and get them back to us as quickly as possible, that would be great. We'll then be assessing those results. And as I mentioned, that'll help us draft the legislation. We've already started playing with some pieces and parts, but those survey responses will really help start to gel it. And then we're planning to present a draft version to the GAA board for consideration. And then ultimately, we're hoping that we'll be at a spot where we can put the draft findings and legislation out at the annual conference and start working on getting some momentum behind it. So with that, that's kind of the where we're at in the world of land use and height limitations as it relates to Georgia. I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have of me.
So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions if you have any, or type them in the chat and I'll try to relay them. While we're waiting, I had a question. Stephanie, based on your previous experiences, how hard is it to do legislation for height versus height and land use? Because I know they're kind of two separate things. Ideally, we'd combine them all, but I guess I'm wondering how difficult that is.
It certainly is difficult. If you ask me right now, I'm going to guess that we're going to end up with probably height. That's the one that's usually easier for folks to wrap their head around as it relates to aircraft, because they're in the air. Land use is certainly a more challenging topic, because that really does start to get into property owner rights in terms of what's allowable and not. So our goal with this was framed up to get as much information as we can around both topics. But I highly anticipate that we'll end up having to divorce them and probably tackle height first and then maybe come back with land use. The example that I gave you of Wisconsin, that's exactly what they had. They had a height limitation zoning ordinance that was on the books for a long time, and then they came back later with the land use side of the house. So there's a lot of states that's exactly it. Most, well, I shouldn't say most. Many of the states have separate height compared to land use statutes that are governing it. There aren't too many that have them automatically combined.
Thank you. I got a question. What are some high-level steps a county-sponsored airport can take to start to implement easements into properties surrounding the airport which have not been established?
Oh, great question. So what we recommend in some instances is that you make that as a part of your site plan review. There's places that we certainly work with that, if they don't have a height or land use zoning in place, one of the things we can do is at a minimum put in restrictive covenants, or put in easements that identify that, and at least put somebody on notice. It doesn't necessarily keep you from getting phone calls because of noise, if you will, but at least then you can say, well, I'm sorry you feel that way, but if you check your deeds, you'll see that there's an existing easement or a restrictive covenant that was identified when you bought the property. Sorry if you didn't see that when you closed. It's not great, because again, it doesn't necessarily keep the phone calls from coming, but certainly is more than it not being disclosed at all.
All right. I'm not seeing any other questions. Does anybody else have any other questions before we end the meeting? I did get a follow-up. If none of those items were disclosed, what then?
Well, then usually it's going to be an uphill battle. I mentioned, that where I just was this morning, we are literally in the process now of, working through using the federal process to acquire avigation easements that allow us then to, have the rights to the airspace over properties in perpetuity, and then, remove trees that are an obstruction. What we do here, what I'm doing with a lot of my clients, is there are some land use nuances in those easements that provide for, no landfills, no wildlife attractants, things like that. But those can be costly, because obviously you're looking at that on a case-by-case basis, and you're following, in most cases, federal process, because you're using federal dollars. So, that's really where it's now on a individual property owner basis. It's not that broader umbrella approach that could be used. I'll share the state of Michigan, back in the early 2000s, adopted legislation very similar to California's at the state level for every public use airport. And so they adopted, we have a state Tall Structures Act, so that already limits height, but this got into the land use side of the house, and it looks phenomenal on paper. So to your point of a higher level, technically we have that, but the problem we have with is that it is not administered as it's supposed to be. The state law says that the Aeronautics Commission was supposed to adopt the surface, which they did. And then it's up to the individual municipalities who are impacted by it to administer it. Well, that example I gave, if I'm a city-owned airport or a county-owned airport that sits in the city or vice versa, or in Michigan, we've got pretty strong township governance. If I'm one of those municipalities that's impacted by that, it's up to me to administer it. And in many of the cases, these municipalities don't care. They're not benefiting in their mind from the airport. The airport's not under their ownership, et cetera. And so they pretty much ignore it. And so that leaves the airport sponsor as the entity that would have to sue them, for lack of a better way to describe it, those municipalities for not administering the zoning ordinance appropriately. They're called state approach plans. But back to my previous comment of, if you're working with a local municipality for other things like sewer, water, fire, co-use, or shared services, et cetera, you're probably pretty hesitant to go and sue your neighboring township because of something like that, or your neighboring city. So we found that it looks really good on paper, but the administration of it and the implementation of it leaves a lot to be desired. So that's a long answer to your question of there are other things that you can do. Unfortunately, most of them are fairly time consuming and usually going to be a little costly to implement because they're probably going to have to be on a case by case basis by parcel.
Steve, I see you're unmuted.
Yep.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of chime in here just a little bit. First of all, I think Stephanie knows that we have a fair amount of information that we got in our system plan for the communities that already have ordinances in place, and we'd be glad to give those to you. It's probably 8 years old now, but it hasn't changed very much. I can tell you that. So we can get with you on that one. The next thing I have is you had an interesting point. I guess Wisconsin, maybe even Michigan, have a state ordinance that basically has to be. It's not really adopted by the localities, either city or counties, but it's a state requirement. Does that help cut through all these, the barriers of the county lines, city lines faster, so that you don't have to see every single city or county adopt something? And would that be something that would, speed up the process of getting this done? I'm not advocating for any of that. I'm just asking that question.
Sure. In my experience, I think it would, yes. The challenge with it is the devil in the details is then the actual implementation. So, like Michigan, they adopted individual plans for every public use airport. So they're all based on the same thing. They're all basically an equivalent of Part 77. But the challenge is the state then kind of wipes their hands and says, well, we adopted it. Now you as the individual municipalities have to administer it.
Yeah.
And that's where it breaks down.
And that's my question after that is, we've heard from many states, same thing is they can put all these things in place, but there's no consequence, or you have to enforce something. It becomes very difficult. So that would be something that would be interesting for, I think, GAA to understand is, great that we have all these things, but if we can't actually enforce it somehow, it's almost, useless to do. I don't know the answer to that question, but that would be good research if you could bring that to the table.
We'll see what we can do.
All right. And then a couple other things. We have a lot of obstruction data that we'd be glad to share with you. It might help you, reduce the amount of burden that people have to answer the questions on the survey. You did answer my last question, or when do you plan on at least having a draft of the legislation? Sounds like around the conference time would be good. Just because you got to get it in play probably before Christmas to get things going. So I think that's all I really had for questions.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Steve, I appreciate, we've taken a look at the land use element that you did with the system plan. I applaud you guys for going down that road with it. So we have taken a look at that already. And that was a basis for some of these questions of where do we think we are today.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
I did get another question. It's kind of related to, I think, the first question Steve asked, which was, are there any states that just require a state permit to build near an airport above a given height, or is this normally always relegated to the local level?
It's normally just relegated to the local level, but there are some states like Michigan, as an example, has a Tall Structures Act. It basically mimics the FAA, OE, AAA, airspace review that you're supposed to do. But so they require you, regardless of which airport, if you're in proximity, it's the same evaluation criteria to submit and get a what they call a tall structures permit. So the difference is, FAA, as you know, when you submit a request through the OE AAA website now, they can find it to be a hazard or non-hazard or mitigatable, but there's no teeth to it. You could still go build it because they don't have an enforcement arm. Michigan, because as the example, because of our Tall Structures Act, they can tell you no. So they may find the same, they're evaluating the same thing, but if they find it to be a hazard, they're in coordination with our local airport. And if the airport says, hey, that could impact our approach, then they can find it and say no and not issue a tall structures permit, and therefore it can't be built. So there's different ways to evaluate that. Some states do it differently. Michigan's the one I'm most familiar with, just because that's where I do a lot of my work. And so they provide that. The challenge being there's a lot of development that happens that they have no idea they're supposed to ask for a tall structures permit. So it goes back again to, educating the local municipalities of what are they supposed to do if they're in proximity to an airport. So I think, some of this is going to be a function of, we can definitely draft some legislation that we can hope get some legs, but more importantly is that education component of making sure that those who are going to have to administer it, be involved in it, really understand what it takes. Because the example with the Michigan project, we've been working with those for over 20 years now, and I can routinely walk into a township or a city that's next to one of my client airports and get the deer in the headlights look that they have no idea what I'm talking about. So explain to me how you're accounting for the approach plan, and there's crickets. They have no idea. So that's really where the breakdown happens. You can write the best legislation, in my opinion, but if it doesn't get the education and the care and feeding, if you will, at the local level, it's not worth the paper it's written on.
Stephanie, you hit on a really good point in that, if we don't leave something behind that keeps the planning people up to date on what is going to obstruct an airport, you're just, one person away from never being, able to enforce any of this stuff. So think about maybe you could recommend some kind of tools that would help. Like South Carolina has their tool. I'm not sure I like South Carolina in that they actually have an aeronautics council meeting to approve obstruction issues at the state level. Not really an advocate of that one, but certainly a tool that would help the planners be, able to evaluate any type of thing in a local community, so they could see their impact. Because I've had great experiences with planning people. As soon as they leave, next group you got to train already, and it's really hard to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think legislation has to come then with tools, because it is an ongoing process. You can have a great group that you work with to begin with, and great, they're all on board, and all it takes is one of those people to transition, and you lose some of that institutional knowledge. How do we do it? Why do we do it? Where do we do it? And it can all get unraveled pretty quickly.
Any states besides South Carolina that do that very well?
Well, not really, only because the ones that are doing things the best aren't necessarily doing land use. They're strictly sticking to the height.
Yeah, and I'm talking about height right at this moment, because that's the most low hanging fruit there is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I like Michigan does a pretty robust job, and I will give them kudos because they're getting, I think the last numbers I saw was close to 500 to 600 applications just from wind turbines alone annually.
Wow.
that
a
they're
lot.
processing, and all of them having potential impacts to the airports. And that's one of the key ones that I think is really important. And I love the fact that you guys are focused on the height, is that a lot of states that I'm working with that are dealing with wind turbines, FAA will come back with a finding of no or non-hazard with mitigation, and that mitigation is your minimums go up. So that, to me, that's an impact as a pilot. I don't want to fly something with high minimums. So that really is an impact. It's not as benign as they would make it out to be. So, those are the types of things that I think, could give an additional layer of protection that at the state level you guys would be reviewing, or at, the individual municipal level, assuming we've got, drawings and things that can support that. So I think there's probably more conversation that, needs to be had about what role would the individual airports play, or municipality sponsor, compared to what could GDOT do, because some of that probably falls on a GDOT level to help provide that guidance, because there's a lot of the small airports or the small municipalities that they're just not going to have the horsepower to really lean into it as much as it needs to be.
Yeah, and then if you make it punitive on those communities, it's really not fair, because they're just not
Exactly.
capable of doing that, and that's
Right.
not really anybody's aim to make it punitive, to sort of stop it before it happens.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, I think we have reached our time. We're actually a little bit over our time limit. So I want to thank you, Stephanie, very much. And if anybody else has any questions or information's been up for a while, please feel free to contact her, or contact myself, or anybody on the GAA board, and we'll be sure to forward that on. And thank you all for attending.